This morning's topic is what is colloquially referred to as Heter Kiruv, that which is allowed to be done, the permissibility for engagement, and it relates to how we connect with non-observant Jews. It's kind of a more recent phenomenon because for anyone who reads through the Torah, and we'll see a very blatant example in source number 1 in a minute. When it comes to Jews are observant or non-observant, and basically one's observance or non-observance determined whether or not you're part of the community or not. If you observe, you're part of the community. If you're not, you're not. You really didn't have much of a choice, because where would you go if you weren't observant? Yeah, for much of Jewish history, Jews really didn't have anywhere to go, and so they were they were either pariahs to their own community or they conformed. Throughout the diaspora, certainly in more recent times, Jews have had the option of opting out and living Jewish lives of Jewish identity without necessarily Jewish practice, determining whether or not they could be part of a community. And that led to certain questions. If you look at the way the Torah presents participation or membership in the Jewish community, it's based upon observance. What happens when you don't have observance? What happens when non-observance is rampant? And what about in the modern era? And so that's the path that we're going to go down this morning. And the example we're going to utilize has to do with a pasuk in Vayikra, right, where it talks about source number 1. If your brother is in need, you have to strengthen him, support him, so that he can live with you. Don't take interest from him. If you have to help him, you give him a loan. You're not allowed to give a loan with interest. And you will you fear God. Your brother should live with you. Right? The idea of helping those in need, you give them a loan. You're not allowed to charge interest. So not charging interest is a very Jewish, well-known commandment, well-known law. Usury, it's forbidden. Right, you're allowed to charge interest in non-Jewish loans, and that led to Jews being money lenders throughout history. But you're not allowed to charge interest to a fellow Jew, so that he can live with you. So the sages, the rabbis, and the conversation was, what does it mean your brother? So the Shulchan Aruch, when talking about this, says usury to apostates is permitted. So apostate, a Jew who has denied their Judaism, is allowed. But borrowing from them usurily, new word we're all learning today, usurily, with interest. Spell check does not know this word, but usurily is a word. But borrowing from them usurily is prescribed. So here you have a situation where the Shulchan Aruch introduces a case that let's say the Jew that's in need of some financial assistance is an apostate. We have to start identifying the different levels of sinfulness. But let's say he is an apostate, someone who denies his Judaism, right? A mumar, someone who's denying their Judaism in practice and in belief. Remember, it's hard to know inside a person's head or heart what they're feeling, but we can watch their actions. Someone's not keeping Shabbos, someone's not eating kosher. That person, technically, you're allowed to charge them interest. But if you're borrowing from them, you can't pay them interest. This kind of comes to mind a little bit like the Hefza and the Gavra, right? You're not allowed to charge interest to a fellow Jew. But if he's not a fellow Jew, because he's not your, as we'll see in a minute, he's not your fellow Jew, you can charge interest. But borrowing from a Jew, as a Jew, paying another Jew, you can't pay the interest. Okay? The Ramah says, and some restrict even usury to apostates. Some say you should not charge him. It's good to be strict if it's possible to elude it. And the Ramah is suggesting, even though technically you're allowed to charge an apostate Jew interest, let's not nickel and dime here. Let's not Jew him. And let's recognize that it's not the best thing to do. So where does this whole idea come from? So the Be'er Hagola, who quotes the different sources for these laws, says that this comes from the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where they're talking about this, because he says, "Kiven she'ein mitzvah lachayo, so delo karina bevachei achicha imach." An apostate Jew, a Jew who's not observing, is not considered your brother. So there's this idea, achinu kol beis Yisrael, but we say that every single morning and evening here in Shul to pray for our brothers and sisters, the whole house of Israel. Well, guess what? a mumar, an apostate, someone who's not living a Jewish life, someone who's not living observantly, someone who's not living the lifestyle of a Jew, is not your brother, is not your fellow Jew. Maybe think if you have to l'reacha kamocha. Well, l'reacha is your fellow. It doesn't say achicha. But it seems that there is an approach. There's a lane here that if he's not living Jewishly, he's not your brother. There's a certain exclusion from religious life or from the rhyme and rhythm of Jewish practice. So normally a Jew can't charge another Jew interest. You can charge him interest because he's not your brother. We see this extended to other realms of Jewish law. A couple of examples: the Rambam in the laws of divorce. When a Jew becomes an apostate to false gods, or he desecrates the Sabbath in public. So this is the mumar, the Jew who's not living a Jewish lifestyle, either the lifestyle or worshiping differently, right? He is regarded like a Gentile with respect to all matters and is not fit to write again, right? So aspects of Jewish law that require a Jew to initiate or be the active party, it doesn't count. So an apostate Jew who writes a get, the get's not a get. You can take this even further. Right? What about counting in a minyan? What about calling to the Torah? What about testimony? Certainly, the idea of being a witness at a wedding is maybe a higher threshold of observance. Here we're talking about the idea that it's almost as if he's not considered Jewish when it comes to these things. So you have a pretty strident declaration of non-observant Jews, sinning Jews, who are not considered part and parcel of the community. They're excluded. Right? If you kind of take this into contemporary polemical terms, right? All those Reformed Jews are not Jewish, right? That someone could say that has a certain basis in what we're seeing here. They're not achicha. Now, there's a big but. There's a big mitigator here, and that mitigator is introduced or summarized by the Rambam. The Rambam is talking about the laws of rebels, and rebels were. It's not just our. Don't think your teenage children or grandchildren. It's the rebels who were when the rabbis gave mistaken instructions to the people, and they followed those instructions. That's the mamrim the rabbi is talking about. The people who do the wrong thing when led by the zaken mamre, the rabbis who give them the wrong instructions. So it's not exactly, but within that discussion of people about Jews misbehaving, the Rambam talks about different types of misbehavior. There are those who misbehave, and the Rambam previously spoke about the Tzedukim and the Baisosim, right? The Sadducees, those who are, for lack of a better term, sinful communities. Those who are part of sinful communities deserve the appellation of rebel. But the source 5, the children of these errant people and their grandchildren whose parents led them away, and they were born among the Karaites and raised according to their conception, they are considered as children captured and raised by them. The expression in Hebrew is tinok shenishba, captive children. Such a child may not be eager to follow the path of mitzvah, for as if he was compelled not to. It's completely foreign from them, the idea of observance. Even if later he hears that he is Jewish and saw Jews in their faith, he's still not considered one who was compelled against observance. He's not considered sinful by not observant, but he was raised according to their mistaken path. This applies to those who we mentioned who followed the erroneous Karaite path of their ancestors. Right? You have someone who's raised outside of Judaism and sees Judaism as completely foreign, is not considered rebellious, is not considered sinful. So what's the appropriate approach? To motivate them to repent and draw them to the power of the Torah with words of peace. Engagement, outreach, this is the idea of Kiruv. The Rambam doesn't use the exact Kiruv. Kiruv is a term that came up later. But the idea of engagement, the idea of recognizing that there's a level of sinfulness, which is not blatant sinfulness, it's acquired sinfulness. I sometimes give the example when I would be teaching this of the idea of someone who grows up completely away from Jewish observance, knows there's something called Shabbos, and knows that there are these Orthodox Jews who observe Shabbos a certain way, and they're invited over to an Orthodox Jew for Shabbos, and the host instructs them, we don't turn the lights on, this and that, and the person says, yeah, don't turn the lights on, and then the guest turns the light on. Now, what do you mean? Doesn't that person know now about Shabbos not turning lights on? The answer is no. The person thinks their host is from Mars. because not turning lights on Shabbos is an alien conception for someone who is completely removed from it. For us, we get it. We're familiar, we're knowledgeable. That's why, unfortunately, I think this came up previously. Sometimes if you're somewhere on Shabbos and you accidentally turn the light off, what's the first thing you do? You turn it back on, which is halachically the worst thing you could do, because you turned it off by accident and you're turning it off on purpose, turning it back on purpose. But obviously, there's the whole fear and angst of getting caught that you accidentally turn the light off. In any event, the Rambam points out that there's a certain level of non-observance which is not willful, even if it is willful. Even if a person knows that they're Shabbos and is not observing, if they're very far removed, there's a certain mitigating factor. So you have, so far, this idea of achicha b'mitzvos, that we have a community of people who are observant, and that is what entitles a person to the full membership in this covenantal community. And it extends to that they're even excluded from certain treatment towards them because of their non-observance. You can charge them interest. They're not considered Jewish when it comes to needing people to Jews to do things like write a get. This is why, for example, they talk about connecting our morning halacha about wine and kiddush to this, and the idea of they talk about wine being poured by non-Jews. The idea of pouring, the idea of we talk about yayin that's not mevushal having to be poured by observant Jews. Where does that come from? Right? It's the idea, because we know that Gentile wine is not consumed, and wine that's touched by Gentiles is not consumed. To some extent, it's a wine, non-mevushal wine, touched by non-observant Jews, also not consumed. That's a whole separate machlokes. But you have this idea of non-observance excludes a person from full participation or full membership in the community. So how far does it go? And where are we strict and where are we more pliant? Where are we more flexible? And so, on some level, the Rambam's distinction, source 4 and 5, gives us that difference. You have the difference between those who are purposefully and willfully familiar with Jewish observance and choose not to, and those who are completely removed or living in a culture that does not, where observance is not the norm. Right? It doesn't have to be someone who's not knowledgeable. You have plenty of knowledgeable Jews who are knowledgeable about Jewish texts and Jewish information, but the whole culture is one of non-observance. And the question is, what happens when that culture of non-observance spreads, even further? Right? The Rambam gives the example of the Karaites. The Karaites are an antinomian movement within Judaism. What happens when can you extend that to when non-observant Jews are the majority of the Jewish population? How does that look? How does that work? And that really became an issue in the modern era, right? Late 18th, 19th century. This became something where Jews were free to assimilate with the rest of society, but also try to maintain a foothold in the community. The community no longer necessarily had the same ability to police the non-observance the way they did in the past. And this led to lots of questions. It started off in Western Europe, Central Europe. It began to move its way east into the late 19th and 20th century. So one of those initially addressed was Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. Actually, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who came before him, who he's going to quote, but we're talking now late 19th century, mid-late 19th century, Germany, Central Europe, and the like. So he was discussing the situation about someone who had lost their parent and wanted to lead the davening, called daven for the Yom. Right? You have a chiyuv, someone who is has a like a yurtzeit, or someone is in the mourning for their parent. So he talks about, he remembers that one of the people whose store was open on Shabbos was in mourning. He was a member of our community, Kaladas Yisrael. That was his community in Berlin. Kaladas Yishurin was Hirsch's community in Frankfurt. He wanted to go to daven for the Yom. The Gabbai didn't want him to do it because people are going to be, what's this guy davening? He's not observant. He's not religious. His store's open on Shabbos. We don't want someone like that leading the service. he went to another shul, right? That's what you do when you don't get what you want in one shul, you go to another shul. That person was also very observant. They just let him daven. Even though he was not observant, people knew he wasn't observant. In the first shul, and Rabbi Hoffman shul, they didn't want this to be the case because people were going to complain, but they let him do it at the Chevra Shas shul. How come they didn't stop him? He says, look, we already have here an established practice that if the store is open on Shabbos, we let them daven for the Yom. And since obviously there were good rabbis there who let this happen, that became the practice. The Afshar, so Rabbi Hoffman is wondering, like, how did this come from? Achicha b'mitzvos. We say if you're not observant, you're excluded. You can't write the get. You can't do other things. Maybe you shouldn't be counted in the minyan or daven for the yamid. So he says it was the Binyan Siyam, Rabbi Yaakov Etlinger, who proposed shemechalei Shabbos bizmanenu nechshavim kitzas k'tinok shenish b'lebein hanachrim. He says that the non-observant Jews of our time, 19th century already, are considered captive children. The majority of Jews are not keeping Shabbos. They're not doing this to rebel against God or against faith. They just do it because that's what they do now. Right? The culture is one of permissive assimilation. I've also heard America, also the American Jews at this time, right? So going back to the mid-19th century, that's all. Basically, observance is something that's not expected. So therefore, the culture is one where it's not demanded, and therefore, even if you're not observant, you're still considered achicha. We're not proud of this fact, but that's a reality. That's the precedent that the Rambam codifies with the Karaites and the Karaite culture, which is a minority culture. So certainly in a majority culture of non-observance, we're not going to raise the standards for achicha b'mitzvos, and therefore we're going to be more lenient. This connects a little bit. A couple of weeks ago with Ashkamashir, we talked about mid-19th century America and the rabbinic scene there and the low level of observance. How the rabbi went to New Orleans, there were no sukkahs there. The observance was just not something that took root in America at that time. It required really the mass immigration of Eastern European and more observant Jews coming in mass to fight against that time. But here we see a certain acquiescence to the fact that, yes, we have an ideal of achicha b'mitzvos, that observant Jews are the ones that count, but we're going to make some flexibility. In this case, in particular, the ritual at hand is leading the services, davening for the Yom. So that again was late 19th century. Let's move it into the middle of the 20th century. Let's take it out to the American scene and how this was playing out. This is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein.
So 19th century, you said in Germany. That was
yes. So now we're taking it to the American scene, and by this time there's a much stronger Orthodox presence in America, right? Post the mass immigration, day schools are developing, yeshivas are starting, and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is approached, and had to do with giving an aliyah to someone who's not Shomer Shabbos, and he's writing this. So we're talking now. We're now, of course, sort of the second half. Moshe Feinstein came in the 30s, and he passed away in 86. This tshuva is, from probably the 1950s. So what about giving a non-observant person an aliyah, right? Like before you give someone an aliyah, you have to like check their, check their tzitzis. That was like the old joke of YU, tzitzis check, right? So you have to check to make sure they're observant before giving them an aliyah. And you have to remember, the 1950s were kind of a heyday of this non-observant trend within Orthodoxy, because there was a lot of assimilation, except in some of those small, more immigrant communities, right? This was the rise of the conservative movement. The people were driving to shul, and so this was, something that happened. Maisim b'chol yom, something that was very common. So, can you give someone who does not observe Shabbos an aliyah? So he says, source 7. He named me etzem adin ta'inu b'sifrei chelik sheni merachim simenu shviyat hashem shebirkas kofer meina bracha klal. Right? He says that basically someone who is a heretic, their bracha is not a bracha, and you can't answer amen. Right? Third line. This is only people who are deniers of God. Right. Basically, who want, they preface their blessing with "I deny God," something like that. But someone who believes in God, right? In America, in God we trust, but their actions are not observant. They work on Shabbos because they have to work, or they have other desires that lead them to sin. It is a bracha. And you do answer amen. And then the bolded line, fifth line down. If someone is a major league heretic, right? I guess maybe one of these published atheists or something like that. Those people you don't give them an aliyah ever. Even though they're growing up in a non-observant milieu, you have to have a little bit of faith, right? You got to have faith. And if you don't have faith, and even though it's not your fault, Rabbi Feinstein is saying that non-belief is a disqualifier from getting an aliyah. But if they profess belief in God, even if they don't observe the commandments, you can call them to the Torah. And then he goes on to say, you should not do this that often. You don't want there to be machlokes. Maybe you don't want it depends if people in the shul are going to complain. Sometimes the people are more observant. They don't want the non-observant getting aliyos. And then he talks about, what about the high holidays? So he says the high holidays, go both ways. On the one hand, everyone is more observant on the high holidays because everyone's more religious. Everybody comes to shul. Everybody is trying to do better. So maybe everyone can get an aliyah. Or is it the other way around? You raise the standards. You only want more observant people on high holidays. So he says, he says he understands either way. He says, look, if someone is a denier of God and a professed atheist, don't get an aliyah. Otherwise, even if they are, sinners in other rituals, as long as they believe, that qualifies them, and every community then has to figure out within their practices, protocols, and membership how this works, especially on the high holidays. So that was, Rabbi Feinstein, very much echoing Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. The idea, it started with the Rambam in the Tino Shenishba, but applying it to the contemporary realities that continue to this day. Source number 8 also takes a look at the ritual element of how do you have this in shul, especially because remember, we started off by saying so you can charge them interest, but you really shouldn't. That's not really a relevant communal dynamic, right? That is in the finance department. But what about in general? It was the shul where this plays itself out mostly. Who gets the daven? Who gets the lane? Who gets the aliyah? So that's how it puts itself on the scene, and that's how Rabbi Hoffman and Rabbi Feinstein look at it. So this is a continuation of that, but begins to sort of transition, of the messages sent to the community by being more welcoming to the non-observant. And this is where you start to pivot from the dealing with the non-observant Jew, which has a long history, to the Heter Kiruv. So this is an example of that. It's found in the Rivavos Ephraim of Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt. Ephraim Greenblatt, a student of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who lived in Memphis and has a 8 volumes of responsa. A lot of them he quotes the letters he wrote to all different types of rabbis, and this is he's quoting a letter of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach about this subject. And he's writing the letter from Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is written to, you see there, Rabbi Michael Shon from Yeshiva Or Sameach. Or Sameach is one of the early Kiruv yeshivas in Israel. Oh. So he says, I'm going to answer briefly on the questions that you had. B'kesher l'nihul minyan tefila avor rechokim sherotzim lekarevosam l'torah mitzvahs ayda hishtatfusam b'sidrei tefila. He's running what I would call a beginner service, a Kiruv minyan. Uvistamech ala sefer hachashuv malamid lahoel. You're utilizing Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman's discussion. Right? Rabbi Auerbach is saying now you're talking in the 70s and 80s. You want to extend this and create community. You want to create a shul, a minyan, to encourage people to participate. So here's my guidance. This is Rosh Hashanah's guidance for Kiruv minyan. He says, you're allowed to invite people who live far away. What's the issue of inviting people who live far away? They're going to drive to shul. So can you invite, the question is, can I invite people if they're going to drive to shul? So he says, yes. You have to at least make it known that they don't have to, right? Hospitality provided. Even if they're not going to accept this, you shouldn't say, don't come if you're going to drive. You don't say it's forbidden to drive on Shabbos. This is going to be a springboard to further discussion, because what's essentially happening is you have someone who's going to drive on Shabbos because I invited them to my minyan. And therefore, not only is it the issue of the non-observant, but they're driving for me. What does that enter the lifnei iver lo titei mikshol, something like in front of the blind? So in this case, Rabbi Auerbach says, as long as the opportunity for them to lodge in walking distance is feasible or available, you don't have to worry about that. Migrash chaniya shel beis hakneses asher bo mekayim es tefillah chayav lios sagur. He says if the shul has a parking lot, the parking lot has to be closed on Shabbos. And this was a major issue for suburban Orthodox synagogues in the 50s and 60s, the parking lot. It was a major issue in the National Council of Young Israel synagogues. It was a big deal that to be in Young Israel, you had to have the parking lot closed. To be a member of the Orthodox Union, the Orthodox Union had a bit of a wider net of congregations. To be in Young Israel, you had to be in Young Israel on the charter, and there's all sorts of financial obligations and the like. But basically, OU didn't require parking lots closed on Shabbos. And this was something a lot of that was dealt with different rabbinical views. Some shows the main entrance was closed, but you can get in from the back. But Rabbi Auerbach is saying close the parking lot. Ratzu ilo litzar mishadai machal Shabbos b'far hesio leminyan l'chodar shem dusha hadorish hatzara. He says ideally you should have 10 observant men making the minyan. Better not to include these. So Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is still sensitive to the fact that some of the people who are there may not technically qualify for Achichim Sheva Mitzvos. So on the one hand, he's extending a major invitation, the potential that they're driving, but he's still sensitive that with a conservative small c that you want 10 observant Jews to make the minyan. Ratzui, it's better. He says if you have those 10 who make the kosher minyan, you can give him an aliyah, and if he's a Kohen, he's allowed to duchen. Right? The non-observant Kohen is encouraged and welcome to duchen. Basically, he's encouraging of this endeavor. So you have it not only in terms of how do we tolerate this, but how do we engage those and bring them closer. Rabbi Auerbach is one who specifically approached this in terms of how to encourage and create, while still sensitive that yes, there is a certain preference or a higher level of the observant minyan, but do whatever you can within certain guidelines, and the like. And this extends. It opens us up to the conversation. So what about inviting people who are going to drive? Yeah. Right. This is all about shul. The shul's doing this in kind of a public way. What about in a private? What about inviting people who are going to drive to a Shabbos meal? So that's something that also was dealt with. We have a sense of where Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is going, but let's see how others, went in that direction. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and we'll look at Rav Moshe Sternbuch, and then we'll circle back to another extension of this engagement. Maybe we'll call it the Heter Kiruv of Rav Shlomo Zalman. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, you see the tshuva there is is in 1953. Right? What is the for Isser in inviting people to come to daven in shul? He's talking about the shul, but it will extend to invitations. Kishayodin shayavo the machinists. They're coming in their machines. So he was asked by Rav Naftali Karlbach, probably part of the extended Karlbach clan, me Detroit. So can you invite? Do you invite people to up to the shul if they're going to drive? I thought that if you're inviting them to come, if it's impossible to come without Chil Shabbos, it's definitely forbidden. He says, he says it's almost as if you're encouraging them to. It's not that you're putting a stumbling block in front of the blind; you're actually pushing them into their vehicles. And even though he equates this with a sin called mesis. Mesis is when you encourage people to worship idols, and he says that even though we extend mesis to other sins, even though you're not punished unless you encourage people to worship idols, right? He says it's still a problem. He says so he thinks that to tell people to come, invite people to come to shul, members of a shul to come to something on Shabbos that they're going to drive, he thinks that it's definitely forbidden. He then talks from the issue of mesis. He then says lifnei iver, the next paragraph. Yesh af be'enam rechokim. He says it's a problem even if they don't live far away. Because let's say they live, a mile from the shul. They're a mile from the shul. Most people live a mile from the shul in this situation in Detroit, 1950s. They're not going to walk. They're going to drive. The super machines, right? You're not forcing them to drive, but you're encouraging them to drive, or you're pushing them into the possibility of driving. He says, let's say you don't invite them, but you announce that there's a davening. And he says, even if you announce that there's going to be prizes for those who attend, right? We see that we're not just talking about a shul, we're talking about the kids. The kids are going to get prizes for coming to the youth groups. He says, as long as you don't invite, you just inform. He says that's not going to be a problem of pushing them to sin. It might not even be lifnei iver because they don't have to drive, especially for those who don't live too far. But only the walkers get prizes. It's like, how are you going to know that? Look, so we see that there's a hesitance. On the one hand, correct, schar halicha. They said people who walk to the shir get schar halicha, right? The kids who walk to shul get prizes. The kids who drive to shul don't get prizes. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is still open, but he's worried what kind of message this yields. And remember, when is it? The 1950s, Detroit. You're probably talking about the urban congregation, the old Orthodox shul in Detroit, probably in downtown, where no one's really living at the same level anymore. Everyone's moving out to the suburb. You're trying to get them to come. There's still that concern. Okay, so then, with regards to, so what about, Moshe backs up, what about being a member in a shul like that's having, that may be more open to encouraging people to come, or let's say the shul decides it's going to give prizes to the kids who drive on Shabbos. So what about even being part of that type of a community? What about withdrawing your membership from a shul that people are not observant and are not doing the way Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is directing? He says you shouldn't go because there should be the last of the Mohicans. There should be someone there who can tell them what to do. Don't think that they'll never listen. A little bit of light chases away the darkness. It sounds like the Lubavitcher Rebbe here, right? The idea that at least let them have a member who cares about this and might be able to encourage them, even if it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So Achu Kol Masham Misnagim Beis HaKnesses Keshura Aval Im Yesh Chasur Meseder Beis HaKnesses Yoshisal Kol Machizah Shvei Nashim Lashim Oshishim Av Mekses Seder Tefillah Kriyas HaTorah members shul. You can stay as long as it's an Orthodox shul. If they mix, if they change the davening, if they don't read the whole Torah parsha, right? As long as they're an Orthodox synagogue with a non-Orthodox membership, and you can stay a member there, even if they're driving on Shabbos and the members are not observant. So you see Rabbi Moshe Feinstein dealing with the tension, right? It's not a Kiruv situation the way Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach dealt with it 30 years later. It's the how do you get along with Jews who don't necessarily achicha b'mitzvos. You should encourage. At the same time, you should stay a part of it as long as the shul ostensibly remains an Orthodox community, even if the membership is not so. And that was very much a social reality you had in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. You don't have that much of a scenario anymore, the way it was, is in the mid to late 20th century in America, right? Those were the days, when you had traditional congregations, right? Chicago in particular was known as where they had, they weren't Orthodox, but they weren't yet conservative. They were trying to, toe the line. For Rabbi Feinstein, that wouldn't be good because they got rid of the mechitza completely. But you see that Rabbi Feinstein is, on the one hand, sensitive, the other hand, trying to maintain the tradition. And that was very much the case, right? It was the 1950s when Rabbi Soloveitchik mentioned the idea that on Rosh Hashanah, if the only shul in walking distance is conservative synagogue, you shouldn't hear shofar in the conservative synagogue. The conservative synagogues in the 1950s were much different than the conservative synagogues in the 2020s.
Mixed seating.
Correct. If that, sometimes it was separate seating with no mechitza, but there was a battle for the soul of American Judaism going on. So that now now we're going to move into the invitation to the personal meal, and this is Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch, who's today the head of the Eda HaCharedis, the Haredi Bezdin in Yerushalayim, but started off in Johannesburg, South Africa. So this tshuva, he's talking to a community that's very much familiar to us of a non-observant traditional community, right? Friday nights were the big thing. No one came to Shul Shabbos. People were not observant. So he's dealing with source number 10. Ben Baal Tshuva Mazmin Horav L'Sudas Lil Shabbos. He invites his parents. A Baal Tshuva, a son goes off, right? Went to youth groups in the Orthodox shul, got the prizes, went to yeshiva, became observant, and now wants to have hashpa, wants to influence his parents also, invite them for Shabbos meal. But they're going to drive home. So he's trying to do Kiruv. But he's going to lead them to break Shabbos. But they're going to break Shabbos anyway. Right? If they don't drive to his house, they're going to drive somewhere else. So and he's hopeful that this invitation, they'll become a little bit closer to Judaism. He's already seen that they're starting to warm to tradition, and he feels that it depends if he's able to get close to them and invite them, even if they're going to travel home. And he's wondering, but is he putting the stumbling block in, right? Because they're going to be driving specifically to him for him afterwards. So near he says that the prohibition of lifnei iver in a practical sense is the same thing. It's based upon putting literally a stumbling block in front of a person who can't see. But if he's doing it for a benefit, that's not a stumbling block. A benefit is not a stumbling block. A surgeon who has to cut open a patient is not considered wounding him. He's considered helping him. His whole purpose is to help them do better. Right? And the fact that he's going to break Shabbos, it's his own fault. You're not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. You're offering a good option, a better option than what they normally would do. And since he's not commanding them to travel, and obviously he's trying to do this, get them to avoid breaking Shabbos in the future, right? It's not lifnei iver. You're not putting a stumbling block in front of them. It's to benefit them, so that's okay. But he's not done. Chil Hashem yeshka. There's a possibility of it being a desecration. But why? People are going to see that they're dry. You should tell them to park around the block, because you have people seeing it. This is the same issue. They talk about, if you have work done on your house, you say you get the work done, but the work gets done on Shabbos. The issue is not as much about the problematic. You're not telling them, you're not paying them to work on Shabbos, but everyone's going to see, right? This is a Maris Ayin type of Chil Hashem, right? You should try and stop them. You see there's a benefit. It's not a problem. Do the best you can. Push away with the left, draw near with the right. To explain to them the severity of violating Shabbos and the sweetness of observing it, and hopefully this will bring them to a proper path. And there's no better way of honoring your parents than this type of an invitation. All right, so for the most part, welcoming, park around the corner, but the idea of, again, what's the reality here? He's dealing with a situation where there's blatant non-observance. That's the default. So therefore, you're not the cause of their non-observance. In fact, you're trying to do more. This is Heter Kiruv. We're going to conclude another example that Rosh Zalman Auerbach is unique amongst, and this has to do with giving someone something to eat if they're not going to make a bracha. Because you have to make a bracha before you eat and after you eat, and not everyone does that. So if I'm going to give someone something to eat and they're not going to make a bracha, I just cause them to sin. On the other hand, if I invite someone over for a meal and I don't serve them, how's that going to look? So there's a bit of a tension there, and many would say the tension you should be leaning towards of religious stridency. Maybe I say the bracha out loud. They hear. There's other ways around it. So Rosh Zalman Auerbach dealt with the situation, and so he says, since you have to, if you're trying to do things l'shem shamayim, source 11, choshveni, I think, someone has an important guest. He's not observant, but he loves you. He loves observance. He's the biggest giver to the scholarship campaign, but he's not an observant Jew. And in Balabayas, lo yisnagim o benimus hamikubel lachabes of michel mishte v'glazeshem mitzadin asuli telechol el mishte neshnitel yodov v'varech. Right, and you invite him in to the office, and he's expecting a glass of water, and you're not going to give him a glass of water because he's not going to make a bracha. And even nicely asking him to wash his hands and make a bracha, or just to make a bracha, will be insulting. He'll get him angry. This might push him away. He'll start hating observant Jews because of this. See, he's tentatively suggesting this. Give him what to drink. Don't think about the prohibition. We don't tell people to sin small to avoid a larger violation. All you're doing is putting the food there. Right? You don't do it, it's going to lead to a bigger violation. You have to calculate the cost-benefit analysis here. By putting the michshol, you're saving from an even bigger michshol. So therefore, in a certain sense, he's using the same type of calculus that Rav Sternbuch made, and applying it also in the situation in terms of how we engage proactively, and how we can tolerate non-observance from a Kiruv perspective. So the Torah expects a certain achicha b'mitzvahs, a certain observance for full membership of the community and for full equal treatment by Jews towards fellow Jews, and being of appropriate levels of observance. It recognizes a certain culture of non-observance, non-compliance, that used to be the exception. As it became more the rule, than the exception. Certainly in the modern era, certainly in the last 200 years, there's been an acknowledgement that the exception becomes the rule. How far to extend it really depends on a situation. Each community will be different, but some basic guidelines have been adopted by the poskim, the responsa. Certainly in 20th century, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Sternbuch, Rabbi Auerbach, different gradations of how proactively to engage, but recognizing that there is this idea of Heter, Kiruv, where we're allowed to bend bend the strict letter of the law and create opportunities while remaining sensitive, right? They're going to drive on Shabbos, but if they know they have a place that they don't have to drive on Shabbos, that becomes important. So much so that many have said that, you don't even have to say, I have a place for you to sleep. It's kind of implicit. So you have, it's taken that Tinok Shenishba idea and applied it to basically the majority of the Jews, and given us the opportunity and responsibility to find a way. And there's no bigger kibbut of an aim than trying to get close to bring families together and bring people closer to an appreciation for Torah Judaism, which might lead them to be more observant. Yeah, you want to ask something? Or?
I think it would be a good idea to make this known in our community, because there are people that think, well, they do this and nobody else does it. Of course, others do it, and
right.
We're going to support.
The idea of keeping an open tent becomes key. Certain principles that guide how we relate to others.
I think most of these are around Kiruv. What happens if the invitation? I mean, do we stretch it? What if the invitations are? I'm thinking about inviting someone on Shabbos or Yom Tov. What if they're closer to purely social rather than Kiruv? And I'll be honest. I have Mekutanim, parents that are not from. We invite them every year for the Seder. We invite them for Rosh Hashanah.
Right.
We know they're driving.
Well, that gets you into the Rosh Hashanah category of things. It's not Litha Iver if they're going to drive anyway. And I think that there are those who still remain strict. There are those who don't embrace these same more flexible principles of bringing people closer than others. I think so you'll have some communities that are less open to this, but in general, my view certainly embraces this approach towards doing it. And
what's especially nice is to have Rav Sternbuch coming.
Yeah, look, he's not in Kansas anymore. Right, he's not in South Africa anymore. But he that's what makes him a unique personality, that he appreciates the real world before he entered the rarefied air of Mashar. Look, I don't know if he would say the same things today for his community. It's a different community, but certainly in a community where you have an openness and a diversity to find a way to move it forward. There are principles, and while acknowledging that yes, there's an article. Rabbi Ari Berman wrote an article. I think it's over 25 years ago that it was in the OU Jewish Action. I came across it looking into the subject. Where he talks about you have achicha sheba mitzvos. That's one category, and and he talks about certain suggestions that he had made and others had made about one day having rabbis of different stripes within the Orthodox community all presenting, and kind of that type of an openness of the rainbow of you can't use the word rainbow sometimes anymore, but the rainbow of Jewish ideas. It didn't resonate because there was a little bit of a concern as to not every community is willing to validate or acknowledge or sit with all the same types of views, because sometimes protecting the community means closing the doors. But it was just but he talks about kind of the aspiration that achicha sheba mitzvos is one lane, and welcoming all Jews is another. But we certainly in as it was true in the 1860s and 70s, it's certainly true in the 2020s. The need to be sensitive, aware, and engage on this. Okay. Any other questions? You're welcome. All right, please God, next week we will pick it up. And until then, stay safe, everybody.
What is